So, hi everybody. Today we're going to do the second part of 3 of my review of a new chess super tournament, the WR Chess Masters. You can check the previous part if you want to see, but one thing mentioned in the previous part, or the two players I mainly talked about in the first part of this review were Gukesh and Abdusadarov, two of the most talented and dangerous teenage chess players in the world right now. Today, we're going to focus on a player who's like twice their age, Levon Aronian. And we're going to see 3 of his games from the WR Chess Masters. Levon was in first place throughout most of this tournament, thanks to the games you're about to see. And one quick thing to say about Levon is that he had a tough year in 2022, lost a bunch of rating points, right? His FIDE rating went down to maybe somewhere around 2735, something in that range. And as many of you may know, his peak rating was well over 2800, 2830 something. And a more normal rating for Levon, so to speak, normal, would be something in the 2780 to 2790 range. You know, he's been a fixture in the top 10 for the past 10 years until last year. So he clearly had a bad year. Now, an interesting thing is, when someone has a really good result or a really bad result, or let's say 3 or 4 good results or bad results, it's very natural to immediately slap a full narrative on that, right? So you'll see a teenager have 3 good results in a row, and people will say they're certain to become world champion one day, right? Surely, if you go back in time, you'll find some people saying something like that about Wei Yi a few years ago. Similarly, when an older player has a couple bad results, people will say, that's it, they're done, it's all downhill from there. This is not always the case, you know. I think one of my biggest missed calls, I have several particularly big missed calls with Anand, of all people, as it so happens, including a world championship game that he was playing, and I was commentating it live, and declared the result of the game and went off to breakfast, and came back after breakfast and had ended the broadcast too early. The result was wrong. You know, I think it was an opposite-colored bishop endgame with Topalov that I said, you know, was clearly going to end in a draw, and we came back, and somehow Anand had won it. So another thing I got really wrong with Anand was when his son was born. And I saw a couple results of his that didn't seem amazing or whatever. And I just thought, this dude's going to retire next year. You know, he's got a kid now. Life is changing. Time is changing. The fire's gone. And then the next year, you know, he kept playing pretty well. And the next year, he kept playing pretty well. And now it's been like 10 years or something that I've been wrong on this prediction. And, yeah, he doesn't play quite as much the last 2 or 3 years, but I was still super wrong on that one. So after last year's results, it would be easy for a lot of people to have concluded that something similar might have been coming with Levon. And also, coincidentally, I think he just had his first kid, if I'm not mistaken. Not to dive too deeply into the private lives of these chess players. But, you know, with his age, a string of poor results, a new kid, it would be easy to think like, well, it's time for him to, you know, switch to coaching or commentating or whatever. I mean, obviously, no one's going to tell somebody to quit. You can keep playing as long as you're having fun, you know. I mean, you could be 80 years old and rated 2200 and keep playing. You don't have to always be a world championship contender. But I think it was easy for people to slap on a narrative like the best years for Aronian were already behind him. Oh, let me make a quick note to myself. I'm just remembering a great Aronian game. that I want to make a note of for later on. So anyway, these obvious narratives are not always correct. That's just what I want to say, right? It's natural for us to, be constantly thinking of these things and get excited by a good result or a bad result, right? Yes, that is accurate, Charlie. Just bear in mind, these narratives are not always correct. They may come to our minds really obviously, and we may feel really insightful when we notice them, and then be completely wrong. Okay, so let's kick this off by looking at a very interesting opening that Levon played here in one of the early rounds of the WR Chess Masters. So the English opening as a whole has been a staple of Levon's repertoire and chess being and personality for a very, very long time. He's really thrived on this opening. It gives him some room to be creative and get original positions. It gives him room to keep tension on the board with some lines that are less theoretical than straight d4, d5, and e4, e5 kind of openings. He's got excellent technique when required. The English can sometimes give you a technical game, and he's ready to do that. And I think a lot of the players who've had the most success with c4 are players kind of in Aronyan's mold who have a mix of technical and tactical skills, and are not necessarily all about opening prep. So maybe want to just dodge slightly around mainline theory to have a little more room for their creativity. You'll get a good feel for that in a second when you see how he approaches this game. So so Prague playing c6 here, kind of like a tempo down c3 Sicilian. That doesn't make it sound good, but this is an important alternative for black. People used to always just play knight f6, knight c6 here against the English, but now there's all kinds of other lines, and c6 is a major one. d4, like in the c3 Sicilian, your opponent can't play knight c6, so your queen would be pretty well placed on d4. Pushes, cuts off the defense of that pawn with d5. Now, a very, very important question anytime you get a game with the pawn on e4 is going to be whether the bishop on g2 would be sort of dead or not, right? So the idea here from black is you're going to play d5, you're going to support e4, and the bishop will be bad on g2. So immediately Levon cuts off the defense of that pawn with d5, and the variation gets hectic. Here we are. And you'll see that the e4 pawn is slightly cramping white's kingside pieces, just like the d5 pawn is slightly cramping black's queenside pieces. So it's a very, very controversial fighting opening right away. He brings the knight out this way so he can come to f4 and keep control over d5. So just like Prague is worried about keeping control over e4, and I think Levon's offering bishop trades rather than knight c3 at the very beginning because he wants to be able to pressure the e4 pawn. So similarly, black's going to want to try to pressure the d5 pawn here, right? The next move for black is going to be knight f6, going after this pawn. Knight h3 is bad in a lot of chess positions, particularly any chess position where black, in a lot of chess openings, particularly an opening where black's going to have a pawn on e5 that's going to be cutting off f4. If black's got a pawn on e5 and you're not obviously about to trade it, then the knight on h3 will often be badly placed. But once your opponent's played e4 and f4 is a pretty decent square, then it's very common to play knight h3 to f4. It can become a very good square there, and obviously f3 is not an option, so you have to be willing to look 2 moves ahead to find a better square. E3 is possible, King Marcher. Yeah, it's an interesting question. E3 is possible. I think the issue here is that, well, I don't know if there's an issue necessarily. Let's just say, yeah, sure, that move's possible. I mean, white would take it, right? And you don't want to take back because bishop takes b4. And on bishop d2, queen d2. So you don't get your pawn back right away, but obviously two doubled pawns here, not very good. Play on the e file. What I would say is, you know, white's bishop is going to get out, and white's going to get castled, and the rook on f1 and bishop g2 and the knight to f4 are all going to be pretty well-placed pieces. So all the white pieces are going to have good squares, even though there's some problems on the e file for white. And it's more consistent, so to speak, to try and maintain the e4 pawn and fight over these two squares. This is the pair of squares being fought over in this opening is e4, d5. And that's why, you know, white's bringing the knight to f4 to fight for one of those squares. And the bishop's coming to g2. So it's more consistent. That said, more consistent doesn't always mean better. Often you have to switch from one idea to another. You know, your opponent reacts to your plan of having a strong pawn in e4, they set up their pieces in a certain way, and it becomes better to then break open the position, you know? If white were playing something really, really slow with a3 and knight c3 and queen c2, then maybe you would switch gears to e3. But if white's developing quickly, knight h3, bishop g2 castles, I don't think e3 is the most powerful here. But thanks for the question. So, okay, so knight f6, knight c3, takes d5, and here the first sign that Aronian is in that, you know, freestyling mode today. It's not all about actually taking this pawn. He fights for the square with knight f4. And he's willing to, you know, even be down 2 pawns if black takes on c4. If black plays d4, then after knight d5, white's going to come out way ahead. I think black won't lose a piece to the double attack because they can trade on d2. But I think their queen's going to have a tough time defending the dark squares after some trades. Like you could imagine here, here, here. I'll just put it on the board to make the position easier to visualize for everybody. The danger here for black is to lose control of the dark squares right after a dark squared bishop trade. And this queen needs to prevent knight c7 winning a rook, but also ideally prevent queen takes d4 taking over incredible central control. So queen here, I would guess that b4 would be winning, but we can try and confirm it because it's pretty much an insane variation, but very calculable. What do we think of this? Take, take, take. And I guess the more active rook means that white's completely winning here. That's my guess, right? I mean, this bishop's not good. But black's struggling with 2 pieces and white only with 1. And this king looks like it's in more danger as well. Yeah, it's just got to be winning with the rook here. So that gives you like a taste of what he's looking at here. So what Prague does is he trades off the knight to win control over the light squares in the center. And now he can even take the second pawn. There's no knight outposting on d5. And black has completely won control of the light squares, it seems, right? And this opening started as a fight over d5 and e4. But in exchange, what he's given up is all the dark squares, right? Because he's put all the pawns on light squares. Even his knight is a light square fighting knight, right? And he had to trade off his dark square bishop to do this. So now Aronian has this funky position where he's down 2 pawns and has this monster bishop. And it's a little faster for white to develop as well. So he plays e3 and switches directions with his bishop. As we said, he lost this fight for e4, right? When Prague traded the knight with his bishop. Black's won control of e4. So bishop g2 is not logical anymore. I know you've played g3, but it's not logical anymore. And Aronian has that flexibility. He switches where he wants to put the bishop. Very, very nice move. Some danger of being weak on the light squares when you castle there. You got to keep your eyes on it. But for the moment, looking to bring this out. Knight c6. He could recover his pawn here with bishop takes c4. But Aronian was in that ultimate fighting mood, right? And there's one or two ways to start creating a narrative, which might also be wrong, around what we're seeing in this game, right? One would be to say, like, this guy looks like he's full of confidence. It doesn't look like he is suffering from some of the reversals of the previous season or year of chess tournaments. Another thing could be maybe he just said, like, let's get back to my roots, let's have fun. You know, maybe he was in some kind of a crisis mode. We don't know. Well, perhaps some people who've watched interviews know. Maybe there's clear record of this. But we don't know how Aronian took last year or what his attitude was coming into this year or this tournament or this game, right? You know, maybe this is something that I strongly recommend to a lot of people if they're feeling the pain of not performing their best. I say, think about your roots and get back to your roots. Like, what is it that you really, really loved about chess? Get back to that, right? So if you fell in love with king and pawn endings and you're struggling with your results, you know, try to trade some pieces and have yourself a fun endgame, right? If you started off chess playing 1d4 and you've been playing e4 for years, and you're starting to struggle with results-orientedness and the grind and not enjoying it in the same way, maybe try out some opening that you played as a kid that was like an early love or something like that, right? So here we see Aronian getting really funky and creative, playing both sides of the board, playing aggressive moves with complicated positional underpinnings. Anyway, it looks like classic Aronian to me. Whatever the reason for it, this is you know, fabulous Levon. He's threatening g5 to win control over d5 for the knight, maybe because this was a key square, but also to widen the scope or lengthen the scope, increase the scope of this bishop, right? g7 is this tender spot for black. And you see black has very few pieces that can really hold off this bishop, but the knight and queen are now trying, and the g7 pawn is the other piece. If you ever play g5, this knight can come to d5 or h5 because the rook is hanging, so it's hard to stop the g5 push with g5 here from black. So that's what he wants to do, play g5, kick the knight somewhere probably bad, and then go after g7. Then if black didn't have this g-pawn, you know, the king could probably never hide here, so that would take away that whole area. h6 is played, dark square pawn move, defending it, and now Aronian just takes the pawn back. h4 doesn't threaten g5 because the rook on h1 is undefended, so g5, hg, hg, rook takes h1. So h4 is not a tempo move here. Just gets one pawn back. Now he's down a pawn. Bishop pair, you know, nice freewheeling position. d6 threatening his g-pawn. And he commits to the fact that he's not castling in this area anymore. He could still play h3 and maybe look to castle there, but rook g1. It's kind of paying a tempo to defend this pawn, but it's also saying the rook could become activated on this file at some point. Like, you could play g5 and recapture with your rook instead of a pawn. You don't have to play h4. You could split your pawns and get that worse pawn structure if you break through on the dark squares. You know, you can be dynamic about this stuff. It doesn't have to always be... Your position doesn't always have to be a picture. It just has to be good, right? So I think I'm a little bit guilty, and maybe lots of people are, of trying to paint pictures with my positions, you know, compact pawn structure, bishop on the nice open diagonal, blah, blah, blah. But it doesn't always have to be like that. You know, sometimes randomly, you know, you mess up your own pawn structure, but you activate one of your pieces and the position's good. Okay, bishop d7. He trades off that knight, and this knight trade is going to increase the scope of this bishop, as we've spoken about. Brings the queen in. There's no way Prague can go kingside, right? You're not going to castle kingside and try and defend these bishops with your king. Maybe that would be a good example of when you would play g5, right, without playing h4. And the threats to g7 are pretty murderous. There's some defense to be put up by knight e5, I guess. Yeah, maybe this is not so convincing what I'm doing here. Let's see. Takes. Maybe I should take with the queen to not have my rook hanging after rook g5, knight e5. Yeah, I'm not confident of how to handle knight e5 here. White is still down a pawn, so they definitely need to play well. I'm so worried about knight e5, I'm thinking of castling queenside first here to try and take the d6 pawn and undermine the dark squares better instead of the attacking move. Yeah, I don't know. But, yeah, I'm thinking castles queenside to take the d6 pawn, and if black plays knight e5, I could win a piece unless rook c8 wins the piece back. I haven't obviously pre-analyzed this variation. That doesn't look obvious. b3, b5, rook takes, and then push. It looks messy, but the upside is if it works out, white will win because it is two connected passed pawns. Your king is ready to receive this pawn or get checkmated if things go badly and the black rooks get too active. And these pawns could win. If black tries to get active with rook d8, rook d1 should probably hold black off. Yeah, well, I didn't actually sacrifice a bishop, right? I won a piece, lost a piece, etc., right? It was a fancy variation. The idea was, is white preventing knight e5 because of this bishop here, right? So I get this back, then I lose this. I can't save the bishop, but maybe more clever than rook here, rook check, king here, a5, right, is to pretend to defend the bishop, capture here, and then push past black's pawn. And now we really have enough to win as long as we can stop the counterplay. Yeah, maybe that's a good idea. So maybe Levon would play castles queenside here. Maybe knight e5 loses, or maybe it's just a really bad ending for black. And without knight e5, white's going to play queen takes d6, actually. Queen takes d6, rook takes d6. And these bishops are still just going to be very good in the endgame. Yeah. Now, obviously, these are like really high-level players, and it's a really complicated position. Black's got shots with rook c8. Black's got bishop e6. I'm not guaranteeing that this is good for white. I'm just trying to guess at what white would do had black castled. Castling looks totally improbable or implausible, but then as soon as I saw the idea of just plugging things up with knight e5, I thought, hey, wait, these white pieces are... It's not guaranteed that they're going to win just because they're a pretty picture, right? Just because white's got the dark squares and the two bishops pointing at the king. Actually, you still need to do some little calculations to see if it works. And then I thought, okay, maybe castle's queenside is strong for white. So in the game, Prague castled queenside, and now Levon takes on f7 to split up and weaken the pawn structure. If you don't take on f7, the thing black can do is put this pawn on f6, and that's going to give you a lot of work to do for your bishop c3, right? The pride and joy of white's position is bishop on c3. Normally, you grab a pawn on g7 to make the bishop unstoppable. That's typical. But here, I guess, if you grab on g7, there's rook g8, followed by taking on g4 with this bishop, and then your king is going to be an issue throughout the game. Well, I could put moves on a board to make things a little bit easier, right? So we can see, I mean, I don't know exactly what the calculations are, but there's some issues with this king potentially here, and there may be other tactical moves or considerations like knight to b4 headed for knight c2 that may also figure into it. It might be very complicated. There could also be a move queen f6, hitting the bishop and coming to b2. So there could be many reasons, but just as one example, right? Like if you take on g7, I think there are some chances for black to make white's king a factor. So queen f7, that's going to prevent f6. It's a less common way of doing it, but it's going to prevent f6. It's going to keep this bishop good forever. And I guess you don't have to worry as much about your king position either with the queen trade. So black safeguarded their king. White safeguards their king just by trading queens instead of by castling queenside. And now can look to torture black with the bishop pair in the endgame. And black's pawns, you know, black's got 3 weird pawns, right? 3 pawns, which you see them and you think like, not sure if that guy's okay, right? You feeling well, pawn? Okay, so we get the active knight move, and knight f3 check and knight f7 are dual threats. So Levon has to give up the bishop pair for just structure. And then more structure. Otherwise, bishop takes e4 is easy for white if they're allowed to play bishop takes e4. The other combative move for Prague would be here, and I'm guessing that Levon would just grab a queenside pawn majority with bishop b7 check there, followed by rook g4 winning one of these pawns, probably like here and here. And so white is up a pawn, and yeah, I mean black's got some chances. The king's in the right place to catch a passed pawn when it's eventually made. This pawn requires some defense, and because of the active rook on e4, white can probably liquidate their isolated pawn and then pressure one more isolated pawn for black. So it's probably a lot of play for white here in this endgame. I would say black's chances of drawing would be a bit less than 50%. Prague went for bishop c6, takes. Yeah, and so now he's not down a pawn yet, but the pawn structure's so bad, he's sure to lose a pawn. I think at will, white could go rook c4 to e4. So this is, yeah, really, really tough position for Prague. Activates the rooks, threatening d2. So he plays around rook d2 being checked by actually retreating the king. It had to go up to connect the rooks. This is a very fine game, right? If the king is, when the king's on e2, he can't make progress with rook c4 or c5 because check and black starts taking things. So he wants to take the king off. Now go here, and if rook d2, he can always play rook c2, defending the second rank. Black can check him and go after the h2 pawn, which I think eventually happens in the game, but that won't be fast enough or important enough. Takes this one. Doesn't take on h2 because rook e5 is good, so defends this first. Rook here. Goes after this pawn. Black's got so many isolated pawns that even though Prague's going to win h2 eventually, he's going to drop one of these other 3 isolated pawns by then and be in a more or less lost rook and pawn ending. Here, if black defends the a pawn with the king, which black did not do, I believe white picks up the e pawn by doubling on the 5th rank. And even if you go this way, the same thing, the pawn will drop. Okay, I'm just wondering, like, what if black switches over and starts counterattacking the king? But as long as we take this pawn in time, the king will have a cozy new apartment on f3. So, yeah, white's just going to be up a pawn with a very good little area of strength here in the middle with the e pawn. In the game, Prague preferred to give up the a pawn because this one is not as easy to control the game with. By keeping this pawn, he can still harass white's king position. But, yeah. Start getting the rook back out from h2 so he can get active. Levon strengthens the a pawn. If king a6, rook b6 check, wins the c6 pawn, which can't be defended anyway. The idea here is if you take to come here and harass the king with checks along the first rank since the pawn is still alive. So he just offers a rook trade, confident that he can win this endgame. Black king is badly placed. King b5, king d4, and the white king becomes amazing. Yeah. And here he actually wins just off of flanking and taking this. The king and pawn ending is completely winning. He plays this move in order to have the opposition. Doesn't matter where this pawn is. King takes, king here, king here, king here. And you see this king can't hold the white king back because this square is covered. So eventually the white king will just keep making progress. Black's got no pawn moves to mix things up. And so forth. Very, very just straight up powerful game by Levon. A game that feels kind of gradual and hopeless from the black side. If you played this game as black, it would be one of those games where after the game you ask your opponent, like, where did I go wrong? Because Levon made it look like the rook endgame was more or less winning. If Prague didn't play knight e5 and go into that bad structure endgame, the position certainly looks extremely distressing with white's bishop pair and the 3 weak pawns. So yeah, Levon managed to just seem like he was in control through the whole game, but remember that it started with a very weird and controversial looking 2-pawn sacrifice, but he just quickly made it work out. So that was powerful, you know, like straight from the opening through the whole game. Here's another game of his that's a little less interesting, in my opinion, because I feel like Anish gave him an unnecessary chance to win this game. So from the opening and strategic perspective, I didn't learn as much from this game as the one we've just seen. But nevertheless, the obvious thing we can say about this game is when Anish gave Levon a chance, Levon played this game in fantastic technical style as well. So it's a Berlin defense. You know, white's not proving anything special here in this opening. It transposes to the, you know, exchange French kind of Petrov exchange French, rook e1, Berlin pawn structure, right? The symmetrical pawn structure, nothing super special going on for white. And at first it looks like Anish is very comfortable in the position, and then at some point he does something. He does something that seems a little bit crazy to me. Let me see what it was. So he goes, so knight e5 was still okay. Queen d6 would be an alternative for black, but you kind of have to deal with that knight eventually. Okay, so you get this position. White gets the space advantage on the king side with this e5 pawn. You have to play this position carefully. The main plan for white is to play f5 and roll you on the king side. This would be white's head duo, would be e5 and f5. If they can set up those 2 pawns, that's an advantage for white. Black has a similar plan to go c5 and then eventually d4 and c4, roll those pawns and make them become strong. Either player could outplay either player in this kind of position, but that strategic struggle is something that that I would think all grandmasters are aware of, if not all masters at this point in time. If not all B players. I mean, people know so much now. So, you know, the strategic duel here, I think it's pretty well laid out and clear. I think people around the world know about it. At the moment, black's position, you know, is sound and healthy enough. There's no reason to think black should get overrun by f5 without being able to either defend it or run their own counterplay. I think Anish makes a queen trade on d3, if I remember correctly. I first reviewed these games a whole week ago, unfortunately. I think what I really didn't like is he trades his queen on d3, I think, and changes the pawn structure that way. I think that's what it is. Yeah, he doesn't immediately do it, but I think maybe eventually that's what he does. I don't know, he does something at some point that changes the structure in a way which I don't like. Or maybe I thought he should trade the queens because he didn't do it. He plays f5, stopping f5 from white. Okay, I mean, this is like a very interesting point in the game. Let's think for a second what he should do. So queen d3 is potentially risky if white can get control of a square on the c file and stop you from being able to push. So queen d3 looks a little bit risky. And if you don't do queen d3, white wants to play f5. So from that perspective, Anish's move makes a lot of sense. He sets up a blockade of white's move, keeps the pawns of Aronians blocking his own bishop. I guess we have to quickly check queen d3 because this is like a huge moment. It's got to be a huge moment because I was thinking that like maybe his mistake this game was trading on d3. Now as I'm looking at it, it might have been not trading on d3. I think this was one of the critical questions for the whole game. So now the question is, can we just play c5 right away for black before white tries to stop us from doing it? It feels like that would be the right thing to do. And now we need to just evaluate this position. Yeah, I would say if in this position as black you let white play d4 or b4, there's a very good chance you would end up worse as black because your d5 pawn is going to be an isolated pawn whenever you break with c5. Whereas white's actually not, once white plays f5, they're not going to want to push e6 too soon and turn it into an isolated pawn. It is a majority. You are trying to maybe queen the pawn from your majority in a lot of endgames, but not at first. First, you're trying to build up a lot of strength by having two pawns next to each other, scaring all the opponent's pieces out of that area. And you're looking to play moves like, rook g4, rook h4, attack these pawns, force some kind of weaknesses. You really want to squeeze with those pawns. So I think you would have to try c5 for black right away. And my instinct is that black would be acceptable in this endgame. Totally acceptable. Okay. That's my instinct. I said this was kind of like basic strategic knowledge of most players, but I can see that there's a little subtlety. I'm not totally confident of all the evaluations. Okay. So Levon plays b4 to stop c5 now. If b6 to try and still get a head duo, surely white would play b5, right? And then you're never getting past that. So if you wanted to try and set up that duo, you'd have to somehow play c6, then b6, then c5 without queen a6 ever being a problem from white. It looks pretty hard to achieve now. He went straight for c5 in this position, giving them each an isolated pawn. Takes, bishop here. And now they each have an isolated pawn. The problem is that this thing is really strong, I guess. If white could get the king to d4 in a lot of endgames, that would be winning. Trade here. Goes to this file. Leaves c3 hanging. But if he takes on d5 and b7, there is queen c1 to f4. So it's not so obvious how this would work for white, right? Like here, check, here, here, here. And that looks like a mess to me, right? Like it's gotten out of control. If your queen were already on f7, you'd have g3 maybe. Like tactically, it would be too late for black. But here, I think it's too much counterplay. So what did Levon have in mind against queen c3? Is it to simplify to the endgame and play the rook endgame with the rook coming here? If rook d8, push the e pawn. Let's see. Takes. And now if rook d8, e6, etc. If not rook d8, rook here. So the main counterplay for black has got to be the fourth rank here. Going for these. The square doesn't look very strong. I'm not sure white can win this. This move gives the feeling of just enough counterplay for black. Because, you know, of course there is g3 possible, keeping like our strong part of the board, but black's going to have this g5 counter. So it's going to be a little shaky. It's not going to be solid by any measure. Okay. Let's go back here a second. Okay, King Marcher has a suggestion in chat, which makes a lot of sense. We're going to check here and then play a5 instead of taking the pawn. Leave this rook covering our king for the moment. This pawn's backward forever. We don't even need to capture it. This is a protected passer forever. We just really need to reinforce f4, and the position's kind of strategically winning for white. I think I could say winning. I think we don't have to say it's like an edge or it's dangerous. I think you could say it's winning unless black can conjure something up against f4 really quickly here. Which would be like, you know, queen c4, rook c4. Yeah, maybe queen c4. Makes the most sense. And there, it's a little hard to prove white's win, right? I suppose I have passive queen f3 as an option to avoid this if I'm really confident in my position, but there is the a5 pawn hanging then, right? If I go queen f3, black could potentially check and take this, and then I haven't proven that I've locked in my winning advantage. Could take, rook b6 and play e6 and rook a6. That might be enough stuff to win the position with. What do you think? If rook a8, obviously the pawn just queens. Wait, that's not obvious. But okay, the calculation holds. So rook a8, white queens with e7. You just have to trust me or calculate it for yourselves. And otherwise, you know, some position with rook a4, rook here, two passed pawns is probably enough for white to win this endgame. They're well enough defended. The rooks are well enough placed. Just probably winning. Okay, so that's... Okay, so Aronian probably had that all sorted out. Anish makes the b pawn more of a candidate. He leaves... Okay, gets out of the way of queen c1 to f4. So now against queen c3, he can surely take with check and then take the second pawn. And now black's just suffering. Another rook endgame. Ooh. Yeah, doubling on the 7th. Letting his whole pawn structure fall apart. That was impressive. Yeah, Levant played this really well. Without the f-pawn, he'll still be able to just barely defend this, and that'll be enough to win the game, I guess. Wait, he leaves e5 hanging? Because then rook e5, rook here is unstoppable checkmate. That was nifty as well. So I remembered correctly that once he got a good position, he played this very well. Yeah, king goes into the corner because if the king comes this way, he's going to rearrange with rook check here and e6. And that's threatening this checkmate. So now you have to go into, you know, rook h8 degree passivity. King h8 takes here. Stops the counterplay. Beautiful. His rooks are behind both of black's pawns. And and black resigned here. That was a fantastic game by Levon, and I guess Anisha's mistake in this game was more subtle and tricky than I first thought. Like, it's a hard choice between trading or blockading. It's a hard choice. So this is a good moment to remember, actually, for... Actually, we should send this position to Eugene. He could put it in the next edition of the Evaluate Like a Grandmaster. Because even a strong GM seems to have gotten it wrong, and it's not super obvious, and it's a very typical kind of position and consideration. Let me grab this position for him. Grab the fen. And send it to Eugene. I like it. Cool. Well, yeah, another great game by Levon, right? Whew. Go Levon. All right. Here's another one. Abdusattorov still had his confidence about him when he played this game, because he brought we saw in the previous video, part 1 of this review, which you can go check if you missed it. Saw in part 1 of the review that Abdusattorov played the Banco Gambit straight up against Nepo. So, yeah, Noterbeck was really just dripping in confidence at this point. He pulls out the dragon, and Aronian was ready to slay it. Plays an unusual move here. Tries to dip out of some computer prep. Kind of a clever choice by Levon right here. The two main moves that have been analyzed to infinity are castles queenside and bishop c4. Long ago, the g4 move was considered like the third main line, but it's really fallen by the wayside compared to the other two. If your opponent... So, I'm not at a 2700 level, never been at a 2700 level, have not had extensive conversations, honest, frank conversations with over 2,700 people about what super tournaments are like. But I have a feeling that there is quite a bit of a hit and run aspect to opening prep now at that level. In other words, the amount of material to memorize has gotten so out of hand that I think the players have to constantly review lines that they think are likely or prepare a new idea, refresh themselves on some idea. So, like, you won't see Noterbeck play the dragon 7 games in a row, right? When he's playing it, he's come up with a specific idea somewhere, and he's backed it up by memorizing a bunch of stuff. And there's some line that's considered good for white where he's found, you know, if you let the supercomputers play long enough, they can draw even the slightly bad positions, right? So he's found some way to kill a position that is promising for white, but he's got something that he's just booked up on, right? So Aronian tries to avoid being the guy who gets hit in the hit and run, right? Like, he tries to avoid whatever deep lines Abdusattorov has just reviewed on castles queenside and or bishop c4. Still get a dragon style position. And Noterbeck immediately plays an unusual move and immediately thinks. Like, he thought 6 minutes on this next move, and I think he had not particularly reviewed g4. And to me, it's a slightly odd move because, you're just going to kind of lose control of e4, d5 after g5 here, right? And your knight's going to be sent somewhere bad. What should you do about g4? I don't remember. My instinct would be that you would fight for the d5 square somehow here. Can Could it be here that you would play e6? Your knight then would only get shunted to h5. g5, knight h5 is not a huge threat, by the way, right now. So you could go e6 trying to play d5. You could maybe play bishop e6 trying to play d5. That's my instinct, is like, we don't want to lose control of d5, so I would look at e6 and bishop e6 as the first two moves I would consider. This h5 move, I don't know. Maybe it's the best move. Maybe he just spent 5 minutes reviewing variations that he did know before making the move and was aware of the move. Maybe it wasn't him figuring things out over the board yet. It could be a total misread by me. But it looks a little bit odd. The knight gets sent to a bad square. The plus, of course, is you've just locked up the king side, right? So there's a plus and minus to this h5, g5 thing. Something important to remember about, you know, most interesting chess games and chess positions is, you know, when you've got good players playing against good players, usually there's a plus and minus to every move or idea that they bring. So the plus here is that, you know, once white commits to g5, the king side is going to be kind of locked. I guess an interesting alternative for white also would have just been to take, right? Takes, and just get castled. And just play this position, right? And so the idea is you're not even going to spend a move on h4 anymore. The knight doesn't have this g3 hop that can sometimes be annoying in h4, h5 positions. So you're just going to switch to putting your rook on g1 and trying to break through g6. It's already been weakened by black playing h5, so you don't need to put a pawn on h5 and trade on g6 to weaken the g6 point, right? It's lost one of its defenders already, so now you're looking to break through with rook g1, and then, you know, f4, f5, or bishop e2, f4 with bishop takes h5, or sometimes there's just knight f5 breakthroughs against this pawn structure when you've got a rook on this file. So I imagine this is an acceptable way for white to play as well. Honestly, I would think this is slightly better than a lot of main lines from Castle's queenside that I've seen. I think this would immediately be pretty good for white as well. So yeah, I'm feeling like h5, I don't know. Initial thought is I'm not a fan of that move here from Nodirbeck. So anyway, pursuing the game, gets castled, queen a5, and yeah, it's a little bit hard to say what black's supposed to do here because the knight's kind of trapped on e8, breaking up your coordination. If you play e6 to control the d5 square, then your knight also just has to sit there defending this pawn, so you can't dream of playing knight c7 to get out and break using that knight. And if you take too much time in this position, white can still attack with f4, f5 probably. Well, it doesn't open up enough room for an easy attack for white. So maybe it's possible to slow play this for black. In general, the more locked positions are, the more you can slow play. So it could be possible to slow play. I would say, strategically speaking, just sort of instinct overview, you look at a position like this and you're not thinking of a6, b5, and an attack on the king's on the white king as black because your pieces are kind of bottled up. So you're not going to have the oomph, right? When you throw stuff at the queen side, white might beat you on the queen side. So it would be like slow play with disentangling the pieces would be one option here. Yeah, it would be a main alternative, I guess. So he played here, here, and trades into just an absolutely horrendous ending. Right? Aronian, by the way, correctly trades on a5, not c3 here, because trading on c3 ruins his pawn structure, right? So he takes the queen with the knight, takes, and here defending the knight on a5. Now you look at this position, this is prospectless for black, more or less. Okay, I mean, if you wanted to specialize in having bad positions and defending them, and you played like this every single game, it's not like you would never draw this position, right? It's not like you would never draw this position against anybody. But, so maybe hopeless is not the right, prospectless is maybe not the right word, because there is the prospect of occasionally drawing a game from this position. But the thing is, you're under pressure short and long term. Like, your worst short term because white's development is better and white has more space. Your worst long term because the bishop pair is here to stay and you're weak on the dark squares. The cramp's not going away. You've got a bunch of pawns on light squares with the light squared bishop on the king side, so that's hard to find a use for that bishop or fix that pawn structure. So yeah, this position, very, 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 very grim. To almost nobody's taste to play like this as black. That said, Aronian plays very nicely this game. We're going to go back a second and look at a suggestion from chat. King Marcher asking, would it be better for black to trade off a bunch of stuff here, right, to reduce the material, and then try and bring this knight where it's covering the king side and can also come out to get some air for black from here? Okay, very interesting question. Sometimes in these positions where you've been a tempo slower than white at coordinating your pieces, the e5 move can actually put a lot of pressure on black on the d file. Now, what I don't like about e5 here is that it lets black put the knight on f5 and bishop on e6. And I was also thinking that black's only kind of got one square for both those pieces that they really want. But e5's one consideration here for sure. Another consideration is f4, f5. Another is to put the bishop on c4. Would you want to trade black's bishop if it came there? No, you wouldn't. Feels like... Well, this may be a little bit of an aside, but let's just test e5 for 1 second, just to figure it out. So the knight is surely going to come to f5 to defend that square. Queen has to step aside. I was thinking like e4, and then bishop e6. Now we have to pressure this thing. I didn't go to f4 because of maybe pawn takes f4. I wasn't sure about it. Now we'd have to sort of trade the knight with the bishop and then win the pawn. No, this isn't going to do it, actually. Okay, so the e5 idea is not particularly strong here. In that case, my other instinct is to just advance this pawn here. Bishop h3 to g4. I mean, you can't really do that because black's bishop is coming here. No, and even if you could just drop your bishop from f1 to g4 right here, I don't think you'll be opening up enough space for a piece sack. So I'm thinking f4, just gaining some space on the king side and being prepared to play either f5 or e5 later makes the most sense. Oh, like in the e5 line, to then play bishop g4 instead of trading on f5. Thing is, your bishop g4, black won't be obliged to trade it at all if you're talking about this position that I had, where I was looking at like here. When you play bishop g4, black's under no obligation to take, right? What are you doing? Best you can do at some point is take their knight, but then I just feel black's got enough play there against c2 in those resulting positions. And their king is safe enough as well. Yeah. This is an interesting suggestion for black to just trade like this. Yeah, maybe it's plausible. King Marcher. I can't suggest anything obviously great for white here. I would imagine white's still better, but by how much, I don't know. Yeah, it's good. All these questions and comments are good, and it's interesting to see, yeah, that you would try and think of cracking a position by bringing the bishop here. But, you know, black's pretty strong in that structure at the moment. If you want to break through it, you need to play f4, f5. If you want to play for an attack, you're going to need a pawn to help loosen up the structure. The other thing you can do is sort of sit on your space and coordination advantage, you know, and play moves like bishop c4 and rook e1, knight d5, sort of sit in the center. That said, I'm not exactly sure how to handle this for white. So, interesting suggestion. The suggestion, what's played in the game is much more obvious to me bad, but let's get into it anyway. So, Abdusarov plays f6, trying to activate the rook, show some weakness on f3, maybe get the knight off of e8 as well. And Aronian, interestingly, makes this trade, which, you know, improves the central control. But he's just opening up for this bishop, right? This knight's defending dark square, so he's just trading off a knight, switching to the pure bishop pair. Then he just makes this pawn trade. You know, black can take back how they will. And now this bishop is going to try and get into the game. H6, rook e8, check, here, and back. So now he's got a couple possible targets, right? E7 and G6. And it feels like the simplest plan is going to be to double rooks on the G file here. Yeah. I'm really glad to hear that accidental novelty, that they were doing commentary without an engine. That's refreshing. A5. Maybe looking to challenge this bishop with bishop a6, since it can't be challenged with bishop e6. Maybe just looking to gain space with this isolated pawn and be able to trade it for one of white's pawns. G2, knight d7, coming to e5. Bishop a6. No trade. Okay, so now black's next move has to be ready to deal with the attack on g6. In fact, I mean, Abdusarov had to be kind of careful that he wasn't just going to lose to this. And bishop e7 looks like a small plus for white. But a simple move would be bishop d2, knight e5, f4, knight g4, h3. That wins. Probably. Well, okay, I'm going too fast. Oh, knight f8. Knight f8 is probably better than knight e5. Okay, so Abdusarov was ready for this. And white can go f4, f5. And surely white is better. But even if you go here and take this pawn, do you have a breakthrough? I guess bishop c3. The question is kind of, can you take over these diagonals before you use your f-pawn when black doesn't yet have e5? And then go like here, here, and just totally tear the king apart. Still seems like it should be good for white, right? Yeah. Well, okay. Not seems like it should be good for white. We know it's good for white. You've got bishop against knight, and black's rook is kind of discombobulated, and they've got two pawns getting attacked. So we know it's good for white. Like, actually, rook g5 wins a pawn, doesn't it? Speaking of, like, remembering that this pawn could also be a weakness. So rook g5 wins a pawn. And if you're not sure about converting against a4, rook h5, because you've got no passed pawn, you could even start with a4, just nailing this thing down. That's a classic, you know, textbook endgame move. So surely white's better. The question is white completely winning or not? Actually, probably yes. If you consider that you've got f4, f5, or a4, or rook g5, the odds that none of those three moves are winning are low. But Levon just keeps the bishop. He says, you know, a4, he can take it, and this bishop has no tricky move. Especially since his bishop would be coming to c6 next. And he says if knight c5, he can move his bishop anywhere and win this pawn. Now, knight c5 would get black opposite colored bishops. Is that any kind of hope? Or is there going to just be a checkmating attack, basically? Ba-da-ba-bum. Takes. Takes. Can we go here and try and force a bunch of rook trades? No, because the a5 pawn, right? Well, this is maybe like the best black can do. And try and defend this endgame down 2 pawns, but with pure opposite bishops and no rooks, it looks very much possible. Wow. I was just playing random moves, so I'm not going to claim I was a genius, but that was pretty sweet, right? I came up with quite a defense there with rook g8. I mean, I didn't think I was defending. I thought I was just showing how white wins. I thought I was just showing like, we do whatever. White just comes out winning probably. But actually, that was not that easy at all. Okay, it's an option not to take and trade rooks. You could just take this pawn, put the bishop on c3, and keep playing the position with 2 rooks and a bishop against 2 rooks and a bishop. That's certainly going to be... I mean, it's not like a good position for black by any means. But did he have anything better against knight c5 that I'm not... It's not occurring to me? I don't think there's anywhere for this piece to go, right? Tell me if I'm wrong, but I think that bishop's trapped and black can force opposite colored bishops. You know what? Miserable as that was probably one of Nodirbek's better chances this game. Because you'll see in the game, he retreats the knight to f8 to cover g6. Levon plays bishop d2, hitting the a5 pawn, and pins it down. There's that move, right? Oh, my misery. This is just, you can't trade anything. All your pieces are back on the back rank with your rooks separated once again. And white's plan is f4, f5. So Nodirbek plays a move which makes a lot of sense given the f4, f5 threat. He plays e5 before white can engineer all this. Thing to remember is if the e-pawn ever comes off of e7, white can think of attacking d6 instead of g6. It's a dark square, and it's just untenable. Bishop c3. Oh, he got off the back rank. Rook d2. Takes, takes. Yeah, but d6 is gone. The knight on f8 can't switch around to defending this square fast enough. Rook here, here, here. I feel like at the time there was somebody pointed out that there was some position where takes and takes was basically winning as well already. But Levon did what I probably would have done, what I thought I would have done, which is just push the f pawn, right? Since black can't take, and then you can just take, and this pawn can't take. Nodirbek played g5, he played f5, and here Nodirbek resigned because the rook has to move off of defending one of these pawns. Very, very simple. I feel like that's what you should do, is just win the game with your f pawn. Don't get into anything too crazy, but somewhere here rook d6 is possible. Bishop a5 also a good approach compared to rook takes d6, folks. I think. Yeah, I'm not sure where it was that somebody thought he could just take on e5. I don't know. Maybe I'm misremembering that there was some rook takes d6 tactic. At the moment, I'm not seeing it. Oh, maybe it's when g5 gets played. Sorry. I think I do see where it is. I think once g5 gets played, because now you can go takes, 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 check, here, takes, and you win it back. Because this is the only position where you can win the full rook. But to me, yeah, it's why risk this, right? I guess it's not much of a risk because you can always go attack a5 with your bishop. But I just don't see the reason to do that. Like he played f5 and black resigned, right? I also love the idea of like taking on a5, they move their rook, then you come back to b4, c3, and you still win the center pawn. I like taking the a pawn and then coming back to the center because black seems so tied up. But yeah, we can rightly say that that was just pure overpowering by Aronian that game. Very, very good decision here in the opening, right? To go G4 and get Nodirbek out of what he must have mainly prepared. And yeah, another very, very smooth technical game from Levon. And with that, he was just leading throughout the tournament, right? Okay. Stop there for a second. Let me make a quick note of where we are. Thanks everybody for watching the second part of my WR Masters review, and stay tuned for the third part, which will be available as well, where we talk about how Gukesh and Nepo chased Levon at the end of this tournament. Okay, folks, I have time to do the third part of this video today as well, but that's how I'm going to cut it up a little bit for YouTube, so it's not unmanageable 4-hour videos. But I have time to do the third part as well right now. I will do that. I'm just making a note for Braden to cut the video at that spot for YouTube. Okay, so let's get to the starting positions of all these games. Let's talk about this next. Playing so godly, what does that mean? Oh, really? He's competing for norms? That's awesome. Okay, I want to pull up one more game here. We're getting through a lot of them today. Faster than normal, weird. Even though I feel like I remember them less well because I prepared them so long ago. Okay, so I want to find one more game here. This one. Yeah, I know that was a losing move here. All right, so now we're going to start part 3. What's the game called? The Dance. Sounds good. All right, welcome everybody to part 3 of my review of the WR Chess Masters. If you missed the first 2 parts, you can go back and check them out. In the first one, we talked about how there were 2 extremely dangerous teenagers looking in top form at the start of this tournament, Nodirbek and Gukesh. Then in the second part, we talked about Levon Aronian having a fantastic tournament, And we saw 3 really powerful games that he won, including, pushing Noterbeck down the scoreboard himself. And today, let me just fix this real quick. 2-3. And today, we are going to talk about the chase that happened at the end of this tournament, and that chase and real competition that emerged for first place. The most critical game for that was probably this one here between Aronian and Nepomniachtchi. And I think up to this point, Jan had all draws. And of course, his last tournament before the World Championship match with Ding, and a very funky situation, as we've alluded to earlier, when you're about to play a World Championship match, but you want to play 1 or 2 tournaments to still make sure that you're in over-the-board shape. Like you can do training games with your seconds and your friends, of course, but it's always a little bit different, right? They're serving something up for you. It's always it's hard to fully match it. The sweat and blood of being at a tournament, playing against other people who need to kill you to pay their bills, right? That's just a special feel. And so it's very common to play 1 or 2 tournaments to make sure you still are battle ready and you still have that feel in your body, in your bones, in your blood before you go into a World Championship match. At the same time, you don't want to reveal your opening prep, nor do you want to hide your opening prep in such an obvious fashion that it tells the opponent what your actual opening prep is, right? So it's a really tricky thing to play that tournament, and usually you'll see that players doing that don't have a particularly fantastic result. You can see Ding in Wake on Zay in January. Certainly not. He actually, I think, conceded his number 2 spot on the rating list to Nepo by having an indifferent result there. Modern chess has become so tied to the openings that at a 2700 plus level, it's fairly difficult to go and play a tournament without using the full force of whatever openings you're just in the middle of studying, right? Like, what do you go out and play? In any case, Nepo had a pretty successful showing despite the limitations. He was having more draws than you would normally expect from Nepo, but we saw a couple really good things from him anyway. And notably, I think both wins that Nepo scored in this tournament were with black, not with white. So it means he wasn't pressing or showing any really powerful stuff with white, but he was able to hang in there. And one of Nepo's traditional weaknesses has been stamina, maybe some motivation, maybe sometimes fading at the end of an event, whatever the reason might be, whether it's physical stamina or mental stamina or motivation or energy. He's tended to do better at the start of tournaments and then often drop a couple points at the end of tournaments. And here, he won 2 games with black in the second half of the tournament. In the last round, he was the last person playing. He played for a really long time. We'll see that game today as well. I don't know exactly how long. I was watching live, but I forget exactly what the time control was, but it was a really long game, so he was pushed. He was the last person standing at the tournament. That great feeling of having worked the hardest of anybody, which I love. And so I think Nepo really showed well at this tournament, did everything that he could have done. I couldn't tell what openings he's going to play against Ding from the tournament. I'm sure Ding and his seconds are more insightful about that than me, so maybe they figured some things out. But as far as I could tell, he came in there and he just fought tooth and nail and looked really strong. This game, you'll see him playing with some energy, and his other win, you'll see him playing with some good technical grind power. So showed everything that he needed to, I think, and looks pretty good heading into the World Championship match. So he's playing a Queen's Gambit, declined here against Levon, and against Bishop f4. It's very common to go c5. Often black takes an isolated d5 pawn in these lines. It's not the only choice. But yeah, I think it's logical against the bishop on f4 to play like this, and I think there's a reason why this is one of the most classic main lines against bishop f4 Queen's Gambit. Is the bishop's not applying pressure against d5, and so you have a little bit more room to just tear things apart in the center and leave this bishop kind of on a random square rather than on a square that's pressuring exactly what black's doing. So we get the isolated pawn. They develop for a little bit. I don't know the opening theory, but they each seem to be playing fine-looking moves, you know, so we'll leave it at that. Some kind of little trick here that matters, that if you bring out this bishop, you're sacking this pawn here, leaves this pawn hanging because of some tactic on this file. You know, I don't know what it is, but probably just attacking both of these pieces. The queen has to defend this one. She could come somewhere here, and you might even just be able to play queen d7 and take one of those pieces. It's probably something like that, but I don't know exactly. Anyway, it was there. He had to be careful in the order of how he brought out the pieces. He figured it out, of course. Develops. Levon's looking to play on the c file. Maybe knight b3, knight c5. Sinks the queen into this square. If she retreats back, then d4 is probably pretty playable for black. Pretty easy life to just trade this pawn. Black has control of d4 and could just play it straight up in this position here. But either didn't like white pushing past with the pawn, or maybe knight e4, taking the bishop pair here. Bishop e5, rook c6. Oh, no, the queen's on the 5th rank. Bishop e5, bishop e5. Yeah, just trapping this bishop. Taking the bishop pair, threatening bishop d6 that black has to defend. Simple advantage for white, probably. So that's why he's not just playing d4, even though he sort of could as far as control of d4 square. Knight b3. Okay, so that's the idea. Wants to come here, pressure this. Now we get what Charlie Silva called the dance. Nepo shows that he's got the draw in hand. He's, you know, he's impervious to Levon's opening. Knight c5 is not coming in fast enough. He can just kick this queen back and forth. She's got nowhere to go. He dances twice every time, and then he says, I want to win this tournament. I've drawn a bunch of games. Levon's in first place. Levon had won 2 of his 3 games by this point, I believe. So he was 2 points ahead, or 2 pluses ahead, a full point. And Nepo just comes after him here with this move. Now, the risk isn't that great yet because he can still dance. But his goal is not to just dance the knight away. He sends the pawn, and he's going to try to play f4 and trap this piece. And just say, you know, this knight c5 positional stuff, who cares? I'm tearing it up on the king side. So the bishop must be saved, you know, by f3 or h3 or h4, which is worse. And if you go h3, your bishop's really going to be quite buried, right? It's going to be stuck in here and hard to get out of this, and now it's like a long way to dig it out this way. So that's an option. He could have done that, but it's a lot of work to dig it out. Also, you know, and potentially black can do something like this and set up where the thing's defended. Also, you have to reckon with maybe white lets your bishop out at some point with f3 and tries to break this structure. So anyway, so he chose f3, which is the most resilient, I think. Like, you know, it stops this pawn in its tracks, and the bishop can just reroute here. So this looks like, I would say, obviously the right choice between f3 or h3, or at least the option your hand would just choose if you're playing a blitz game or something like that. Let's dance. And now hits him with f4. Trade here. So what do we think of Nepo's aggression? Is it warranted or not. Who risks more here? The person leading the dance or the person being led in the dance, right? Okay, but seriously, black has weakened their own king position significantly and turned the d pawn into a pass pawn by trading white's e pawn at the cost of advancing the g pawn. The f pawn also, gives black some space. There's some aggressive things you could do with it. You could plunk something into e3. You could try to put a rook on g8, go bishop h3. I think he does that this game. No, I know he does that this game. Not the plunking on e3, but the rook g8, bishop h3 idea. A lot of it revolves around whether or not white is able to plop this knight on d4 in a good way. If white's able to just occupy this blockade square here, trade one or two pieces, put rooks on the e file, let's say, then from strong squares in the center, white's king will not be in danger and black's king will be. In other words, rook g8 and bishop h3 are not going to work out if white's already taken over the center. So that's kind of the question, is can white just plop knight d4 and get to the e file quickly with the rooks and take over? Dynamic question. I don't know the answer, so let's go try and discover it together. Okay, so after the dance comes here, and this should prevent knight d4 because of knight d4 hitting the queen, and the queen can't take back while the bishop's here, right? So simple enough. Bishop f6 has prevented the first attempt to occupy here. White could keep dancing with queen here, looking at knight c5 or knight to d4. That could be logical. Instead, white plays rook f to c1. Which I would say nicht überzeugend, not convincing. This idea of coming to the c file. What would be the idea? Because this b pawn is blunting both rooks and your queen. What would be the idea of coming here? Maybe to play knight d4, and when black takes, to just take on c8 with your queen? Because otherwise the mechanism to break through on this file is to eventually set up bishop takes a6. That's how you make something of rooks on this file against the knight. And that seems like, pretty far off to set up and unlikely to win this game quickly enough. So let me see, if I do nonsense for black, can white play knight d4 here? So I'm going to play a move for black, which I hope does nothing. What would that be? I don't know. I'll play bishop f7. Now I'm going to... Oh, no, that undefended c8. That was like the opposite of doing nothing. It's really hard sometimes to find a move that does nothing when you need one. During games, we all the time are playing moves that turn out they do nothing, and we're like, why did I waste time on that move? And then you just want to waste a move so that your opponent... So you can check if something is a threat, and suddenly you can't think of anything. All right, play h5. Knight d4. Knight d4, queen c8. I just want to count how many pieces are on the board. It's easier for me to just play it out with all of you, and easier for you to follow than if I just rattle it off in my head. So if black moves the king away, there's rook c7. And if black takes here, 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 black's up a piece. So that's not a real threat. Knight d4, knight d4. That was easy. Black just takes everything and they're up a piece. Okay, so rook c1 does not threaten knight d4. And therefore, I'm going to just say I don't like this move. I think it's off to the side of the purpose. I think it's missing the point of the position. And to me, I want to suggest something that's more logical to me. Queen b6, continuing the knight c5 threat, just continuing the dance. Well, you know what? Maybe he was afraid that if he played a random move, like putting the rook on the e file, that black was ready to move the knight himself, just unveiling attacks, knight d4, knight e5 or something. So maybe rook c1 was played just to prevent a threatening move from black. Is that right? Maybe that was the meaning. Not to set up knight d4 for himself, but to try and avoid what Nepo could do. But if that's the case, just get your queen off this file, dog. Like, you can't just hang out here. I mean, he couldn't have been tired of dancing, could Levon, right? He was ahead in the tournament, and Nepo had avoided the threefold repetition already 3 times at this point. So I think Levon should have just kept dancing. And if Nepo takes the draw, he takes the draw. And more likely, Nepo was just going to keep trying to find a way to turn this game into gold. And I'm not sure how he would have done it. But okay, so I'm not a fan of rook c1. Queen g7 comes in. So definitely no knight d4 now. Now black's got firm control over d4. And I feel like, based on my own rule of thumb, which I just invented, and we don't know if it's true or not, but I feel like the position should be pretty satisfactory for black if they control d4. I don't see white doing anything here that makes me worry about the black king. Because as I said, I feel like you'd have to first take over central squares, d4 and the e file. And then we could talk about, from that position of strength in the center, you know, bullets aiming along the diagonals towards the black king. For the moment, I feel like black has pretty good control over the central squares, and the d-pawn's looking like a little bit of an asset. So queen d6, poking the bishop on e6. It gets defended. And here's the moment where you would show, and of course he switches to the e file, which is maybe correct, but this would be the moment where you would show the grand power of your rooks on the c file. This is the classic breakthrough. You'll see it more often in endgames than in middle games as a way to, because in endgames it often gets more like sort of static and you have the time to set this up and carry it out. So what would happen here if he went for this in this position? I mean, clearly it probably didn't work since Levon didn't go for it, and it was probably not a move that he hadn't seen. So clearly it doesn't work, but let's see if we can figure out why or how it doesn't work, right? Maybe bishop takes b2 for black, hitting the rook. Then you go to e1 with the rook. That's okay from white's perspective. The knight on c6 will still be hanging even with only one rook on the c file. Could it be black taking on a6 and giving up c6 and then attacking with the bishop pair somewhere? The position's chaotic, you know. There's variations like d4 hitting the knight. Bishop takes. 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 Hitting this, right? Rook e6, bishop d5. And white's better. Right? Now white's broken open the center, right? The rooks are coming, black's king is weak, and white's got passed pawns. So that's winning for white, I would imagine. Take on c2, take on e8. That also looks good for white. Here you can take on b7 with the queen, and if white takes c6, you take here. But white has knight c5, and I think it doesn't work out for black. Actually, I can't be sure, can I? Queen f7, queen c6, queen c8. Knight takes, rook takes, rook takes, rook takes, rook takes. This endgame, I was going to say black has just enough to hold with the d-pawn, but actually I walked into this, and I really need that tempo. I need d3 here, because I need to threaten bishop b2 and queening. So I guess white's going to have an advantage here as well, a bit of an advantage. Maybe the best we could do is trade here, saying that this rook is now not guarding the pawn, and there's still some chances for black. Notice we're down 2 pawns, so we need something pretty amazing as everything here collapses. Bishop a6. There's also bishop e5, bishop e7. And bishop h3. Many moves. Oh, bishop h3. No, bishop f1. I think bishop h3, if white defends this with g3, you can defend your knight here and then take this. Although even that I'm wrong about. The queen comes here and then rook c6. Totally wrong. But anyway, bishop h3, the simplest, right, is white can just come here and defend it. So that's not the answer either. Bishop a6. I just don't know what it is. So let's look at bishop e5, the only other move I had in mind. Queen c5. And what could black have in mind here? Can we now take on a6 or b2 now that the queen's not attacking our bishop? Bishop b2, rook e1. Just keep playing. Thing is, like in some position like this now, for example, white may get control over d4 by giving up the bishop pair, and that might be enough to stabilize white's position. I mean, we always have to keep our eyes on this, though. Oh, it's a heck of a complicated dynamic position. It looks to me like at this point in this game, Nepo was way behind on time. He was the one avoiding the draws, but he put in a lot of work. Look at him down with, 14 minutes against an hour. He put in a lot of work to try and keep this game going. But bishop a6, yeah, it would have been interesting. I think we can't give a clear evaluation on it. Obviously, 10 seconds with a computer would tell you, like, oh, Aronian missed this chance, or oh, this would be a blunder, and that's why Nepo was a genius. But you can see how much work the players would have to put into this position from that sampling of lines I gave, right? Like, even for them, I mean, they're superhumans, but they're also humans, right? There's a limit to how quickly they can calculate everything, and that is a mess of variations to sift through, and the evaluations aren't always obvious, so that'll slow down your calculation when you have to hesitate over the evaluation of the positions you're considering. So this move was complicated. I mean, we're going to assume that it wasn't very good for white and that the two players probably got it right since Nepo allowed it and Levon didn't go for it. But whatever the refutation was, you guys, what you've learned, okay, a computer would tell you if this was good or bad. But what our little effort here has done for us is explain to us what kind of effort goes into these decisions. Why Nepo was so low on the clock, how much effort this was for him. And maybe that Aronian was a little bit too calm and cool as a cucumber here, right? Because he's got so much time on the clock. But maybe should have spent more time on something like rook c1 or bishop a6 or something. Maybe he was being too cavalier about putting pressure on Nepo's clock and was too confident in his position when actually these are pretty critical and difficult positions going on here. I don't know. So rook e1, knight to e5 comes, and now things are getting dynamic. He's already starting to make some threats. Knight takes d3, knight f3, but there's also rook takes e6, so be careful. I remember with clarity from when I reviewed this game before that this next move, knight d4, is a mistake. Because I figured out it puts the knight on a poorly defended square against this bishop and queen, and after bishop h3, Nepo's winning. So the idea is basically that Nepo wants to play knight f7, hitting the queen and unleashing this attack. But knight takes e6, counterattacking his queen, refutes that in this position, right? So he gets the bishop out of the way of this knight, threatens checkmate, the bishop retreats to f1, and then knight f7 comes back, revealing the attack on d4. And it's very clever because he's undefended d5. There's the diagonals to the king, but the knight blocks that. Levon had just not calculated this very carefully before playing knight d4, I guess. And here he spent over 10 minutes, retreated to stop the checkmate. This came in, and now rook takes e1. The bishop is overworked. And simply put, Nepo comes out with an extra piece. Now, there's still work to be done because his king is awkward, but he converted this game very convincingly. So I think it's pretty clear that knight d4 was a straight up tactical oversight. And yeah, I feel like this game, Levon almost played too confidently, right? Putting pressure on Nepo's clock, but Nepo was up to the task with low time to calculate some variations. As I said, Nepo looked quite good in this tournament, right? So he was working so hard to turn this into a game and to avoid the dance all the way to a draw. And he was getting himself into time pressure. He was playing very aggressive, non-standard G5, F5, F4 plan, creating a really dynamic situation. This is a kind of position where I can understand that it would be very easy for Nepo, for Black, to actually have blundered this game. And we should bear in mind when we talk about how well he played that he didn't blunder in this game, because it would have been very easy to do so. Low on time in a position this complicated, very easy for Black to blunder. Even this move here, he had to calculate queen d5 check. Maybe Levon didn't expect him to offer this pawn with check, but it would transpose to what happened in the game, right? He goes knight f7, and he's still got the checkmate threat, so there's no time to take the rook. And you would get the same deal. White has to stop the checkmate, and then Nepo will take on e1 and win the knight on d4. For completeness, I'll show you some more moves of this game. This bishop retreats because it's now, well, I mean, gh3, queen g1 mate, but I mean, it's risky to just leave it sitting there. Okay, so now he's threatening rook e1 and bishop e6. Bishop to b4. Tricky. I wonder if on bishop e6 he has queen. No, he has rook e2. That was tricky. That's what bishop b4 did. So now you just attack this a million times. Takes, here, takes, here, takes. Oops. Yeah, so that was tricky. So he avoids bishop e6. Queen f6, reinforcing the e6 square, but also making a better square for the king on g7. So you can keep defending the knight, which h8 doesn't do, but you can get off of this diagonal if you need to. Oh, and this move! I remember. This is a good reason to see the rest of the game. What a shot he delivered right here. Bishop c3. That's not how you're expecting to dig out when you're up a piece and trying to dig out and right, like you're expecting moves like bishop e6 to trade bishops. You're expecting moves like queen e5 trying to trade queens, right? Oh, that was a smack of a move. Going for rook e1 checkmate. This move would not have worked in a previous position with the bishop on c4, I recall, right? Like in this position here, if you cut white off from rook e1 with bishop c3, it's just queen f7, right? Taking off the black pieces, and then bishop here covers the checkmate. But here, bishop c3 takes with the queen, and you can't take the queen because of back rank mate. That's just, yeah, that's just a sweet move. Nepo was really shining this game. So g4 to get rid of the back rank, and then he just retreats. But now he's got all these dark squares to use, right? Knight on g5 or e5, rook on e3, queen on the long dark square diagonal. And he's got it under control. Stopping queen h7. He can come back. And that's checkmate coming up. The king moved here because if you back off of the queen trade, there will be knight g5 check and queen takes rook. That's why you can't play like a simple retreat. Or does he have nowhere to even go? Well, I guess like some square like this, right? Knight g5. So he goes king h4, rook here, just trying to checkmate from behind. And if h3 should be good enough to just trade queens and then close the mating net. Really precise, confident calculation throughout that game from Nepo. Powerful game. And in general, at Super Grandmaster level, these kind of IQP positions lead to a lot of draws. Like, the players kind of know the pawn structure, and they often play, fairly correctly, and you see a lot of stodgy draws at the 2700 plus level in these IQPs. Nepo really had to come up with something unusual, and this game has that feeling of that Magnus Carlsen can give you, where it's like a player just exerts their will on a position and without violating strategic principles does something that just bends an equal looking game to their will, and they make something out of nothing and sort of overpower the opponent. That's the feeling this game gives. And yeah, Nepo was on strong form, and that made the tournament more competitive. Then Aronian was only ahead by half a point over Gukesh, and Gukesh took advantage of that with the following game. Playing the Rogozin here. Let's talk a moment about Gukesh's openings. He came into this tournament and was playing the Queen's Gambit accepted. So Esipenko plays, sort of like a Catalan. And Gukesh switched it up this game, didn't he? Because he didn't play d5 on move 1. Interesting. So we get to a mainline Catalan. Yeah, RD Born. The last round game where Nepo squeezes Kamer is also very impressive, and we'll be looking at it soon. All right, so solid pawn on d5, bishop a6. This is a logical place to put the bishop when the opponent's bishop has left f1. You can often find some weakness on the c4 square, and at a simple level, the idea is like attacking the e4 pawn as black in the French. You're trying to threaten this enough to get white to make this trade, and then you're solid, right? You've equalized those pawns and the space advantage. You can put a rook on the c file. You know where everything goes, and your bishop is still perfectly good. Some would say it's better than the bishop on g2 in these positions. So that's the basic idea, right? And what I mean by that is it's similar to the idea that in this kind of position here, black's trying to say the pawn's hanging, and the idea is to get white to play this structure, right? And so every time white defends that pawn, black attacks it with knight f6 or with bishop b4, and the point is we attack this until we get white to equalize the structure. So bishop a6, pressuring the square. Now, a lot of white players will just gambit the pawn on c4 rather than conceding that, just like Esipenko does here. And so he's playing for an advantage in the center. If the bishop weren't on d2, you would sometimes see knight d2 trying to sustain that square. This is a move which works particularly better against knights on c3 than knights on d2. The knight on c3 blocks the queen's defense and doesn't defend c4 herself. If the knight were on d2, then bishop a6 is not as strong because you don't have much pressure, but you're also not under as much pressure on d5 with the knight on d2. So then you'll more often see like bishop b7 and c5 as a response to a knight on d2. Does that make sense? Hopefully. Just a little tidbit off to the side. Okay, so Esipenko goes for it with e4. Rook has to come off the diagonal of the bishop. Power up the center. Sup, Claude? Looking at games from the WR Masters Super Tournament here. The final portion of the tournament, the final race for first place. Gukesh half a point behind Aronian. All right, so now he's got this extra pawn. He just sits on it there, and he answers like a Moran. This e5 move. Whew. Yeah. This was a move that was a big surprise to me. I remember when I saw this, because it had not occurred to me that you could just do this without control over the e5 square. And so takes here, and then something like bishop f4, let's say, holding the pawn. I think e6 is probably not a big scare for black. You can take it. Your piece is all right. Your structure is all right. I don't think we need to like go crazy about it. I think the issue is that on bishop f4, maybe you can go bishop c5 or g5. Something like really aggressive is the justification. But it hadn't occurred to me to just leave the e5, to just play e5 with it hanging in this kind of a position. Had not occurred to me. Without like bishop d6 or queen c7 in place. So d5, knight g4, bishop f4. I guess he would just play g5 maybe. Bishop c5, knight d1. I don't know if that helps black at all. I don't know if it hurts black either. Oh, you can't play g5 later then. I mean, yeah, you could do something like here, trade off. Oh, your bishop's going to get hit. You get pushed away. Yeah, that looks not good. We just didn't have time for... I wanted to play rook e8 here, but the bishop's hanging. So let's say g5 now or never. As Claude's telling us, g5. Hit this piece. If h3, whatever, as long as the knight doesn't get kicked back, it's okay to have some chaos here. That's fine with black. Some chaos is fine with black. And this resulting position is fine. Well, maybe winning for black-white structure is actually really, really bad. So g5, and if the bishop comes back somewhere, then you can take here. And, okay, g5 is an ugly-looking move, but overall I would say Gukesh, you know, had a brilliant insight here. You know, a maneuver which I can add to my, or a trick, a tactic, a pattern that I can add to my bag of tricks, because this position should be perfectly good for black. You know, concretely, your pieces got squares, and you know, you're still up your pawn. Move like queen d3 or bishop c5 could be in the offing. So yeah, really, this was a move that shocked me and looked really cool. Right, knight d3 could be coming as well. So yeah, I really like this idea. e5, never seen it before. Esipenko just retreated this knight to maybe threaten to recover this pawn here. I mean, I suppose you could play rook d1 or whatever he wants if he's not actually taking this pawn. Maybe h3 as an idea. Oh, but yeah, he's got to be careful about pawn takes, and then the knight moving when the knight on d4 is hanging. Right, so he's saying, yeah, if black takes on d4, he needs to put a defended piece on d4. Okay, I understand why Andre felt the need to go knight e2. That makes sense. Now, knight g4. Gukesh does not spend the tempo on keeping this pawn. It's a tempo because you have to pay it right here. Trading, obviously, itself is not a tempo when white recaptures, but white recaptures with development of the rook on a1 and a threat to the bishop. So that's going to cost you. I mean, I suppose you could just trade it off to not lose tempo and go here, trying to get active with the remaining pieces, and hard to judge how good or bad this would be. c6 looks very weak. Knight d4 here, knight c6. Got to hold on to that bishop. e5. Opening this. Oh, black's dead. Black's dead, actually. Easy to evaluate now. You see how that happens sort of by force? Knight e5 would be the move that would be more interesting, sorry. And then maybe takes. Takes. Basically an undisputed advantage for white, right? With the bishop pair in this position, better central presence, e5, pawn, rook. Yeah, so it's just going to be great for white. So yeah, so he gives back the pawn, trades on d4. Oh, and he's going to place a knight on e5 to defend c6 right here. Logical. He's just got to have an answer to f4, taking the defender off of c6. Doesn't happen. Let's just quickly see. f4, queen takes d4 check. Easy enough. Okay, so yeah, so basically successfully keeping up with the tempo of the fight over these central squares. He gets e5 for the knight, hits this on the d file. Knight gets defended. He can always win this pawn back later if he really wants to be up a pawn because it's isolated. Pawn takes c4 is not looking that great from Andre now. Right? Maybe that was not the most precise here. What would be the best? I'm thinking maybe like bishop c3, fighting over d4 and e5 right here, trying to stop this knight from establishing itself. Oh, if h3 here, here's a thought. Black was maybe going to take to get e5 for the knight, and then if you take, play d3 and win back your piece. So that's why you can't kick this knight. That's why he can just send the knight here when he doesn't yet have it square. It's because here, it's because on h3, he's got pawn takes pawn, securing the square, even though it doesn't hit a piece. That's a very, very important detail. Like, you can't just, very rare that you could just sit your knight on g4 before the pawns have traded. Very, very rare that you can do that. So it's a lot of really precise calculations here from Gukesh to get this position. Takes. Yeah, so anyway, my thought for white, maybe better to just fight Gukesh for these squares. And prepare rook d1 faster, could harass in some positions. I think taking on c4 does very little for white, actually, now that I'm thinking about it. Because Gukesh immediately isolates that pawn. c5 is blockaded, completely controlled by black's pieces, right? So what value is this c4 pawn for white? It seems like minimal value. Like if Gukesh stabilizes the position, he'll often be able to win that pawn again later. So why do we spend a tempo on it when there's a sharp fight over the d4 and e5 squares here, right? Bishop c5, rook d1, queen gets out of the way. Yeah, you can see this pawn. It's like he can take it whenever he wants it. f4. Estepenko got tired of waiting. He wants to play e5 and attack. Or knight f5 and attack. Gets blocked by f6. Why the queen and not the rook? Looks slightly mysterious. Oh, well, now we see. He felt like he couldn't stand the knight forever. Oh, yeah, because this queen is coming to g4 and so forth. So he's going to have to let this bishop become more powerful. And that's why the rook didn't come, because this pawn would just be hanging. Right, rook d8, queen e2. That's, again, excellent foresight by Gukesh. To understand that he is going to need to play g6 at some point and that he can't do it in this kind of a way. Wow. Queen d8 instead of rook d8, right? I mean, white could play rook d1. How many of us would be thinking, like, we got to fight for the open file. It'll be more important than other stuff. And Gukesh is calculating this queen e2 line already. Blocks c5, locks it in. And yeah, he just takes over the position from here, sacks back his extra pawn yet again in order to get this rook into the game, knowing that he's parried the threats, he still has the majority, and as these files both open up, he's now going to have the advantage here. Estepenko took it, and he creeps in and keeps the knight on e3. There's no rook d3. Bishop takes because of the back rank. There's always the back rank. And even just this immediate win as a threat. So white gives check to not get back rank mated, because the rook's attacked and the back rank's hanging, and rook d1, knight d1. So he has to trade off pieces. Now this king is even more secure, and the outside passer is worth even more. And he just comes and cleans up the a-pawn. Locks the bishop out. Keeps white completely tied up with these queen and knight on aggressive squares. And here white actually resigned. It's so hard to do anything. If you try and let your queen out with e5 or e takes f5, Gukesh moves his bishop to d5 and just traps the queen, basically. Just absolutely brutal. How confidently he converted this game from the black side of the Catalan. Yeah, wow. Wow. That game. And before I move on to our other key game, I want to make one more little note about Gukesh while we're talking about Gukesh. So with this game, obviously he catches up with Aronian, ties for first, and eventually does finish tied for first. You know, no spoilers here because it's there, and anybody who'd be watching this video probably knows the results of the WR Masters anyway. But I want to point out something else about Gukesh's success at this tournament. Something other than these two wins that we showed of his, one in part 1 and one in part 3. Fantastic, unbelievable calculation games, super powered. But I want to assign his success, I want to give another cause for his success at this tournament, which is his opening prep. So here's a game in the last round that he played with Aronian. Playing a bishop b4, queen's gambit declined. What I want to say is Gukesh came to this tournament very, very well prepared with his black openings. Just bulletproof. Look at this trick here, knight c6. Knight takes, trades off on c3, recovers. And this position is just dead stable. There's nowhere for white to make any inroads or make any attacks. Like at move 14 here, there's basically nobody in the world who's going to beat Gukesh in this position other than maybe Magnus. No one else would ever win this position as white, I don't think. It's just nothing to do. Completely solid, kills the game. Here's his queen's gambit accepted against Nepo. And these are the two players who tied for first with him in the tournament, right? And you'll see he just kills them with black immediately. Just immediately gets into the game, leaves b5 hanging, c5 neutralizing, and he gets straight to this position here, right? Again, in like a dozen moves. Very nice judgment to just trade. People often push. Sometimes they sack, but you can only leave the sack hanging so much. He trades with the idea of just pushing this pawn to a5. He gives up the b5 square, but he gets the b4 square. Totally safe immediately. And he actually played a longer game this round against Nepo and actually pressured Nepo this game. Like he actually was able to eventually put pressure on Nepo because he had such a safe and solid opening this game. The game with Aronian died immediately because Aronian just went back and forth with the bishop like this, and that secured them each a tie for first place in the tournament, and you know there's nothing for black to do to avoid it. But you know, playing in this kind of round robin, if you can kill a bunch of games with black, that gets you a long way towards a good result. So in addition to the fantastic wins we saw from him, let's just point out that his openings were really solid this tournament. Nobody was really threatening him very much, actually. And now, the main event. Here is Nepo's epic final round game, which, as we mentioned before, gives us a sense of what kind of strength and form Nepo might be in right now. So, playing a confident King's Indian defense. Yes, he is. Yeah, Kamer's playing super solidly. Oh my gosh, e3 and h3 in the opening. And then looking to grab a little space here. Seems to me that castling is more prudent at this point. If you're like b4 tells you that you're going to castle kingside, right? So maybe it's more prudent to just castle. But this is obviously a normal plan. From the restrained e3 setup, you're always going to want to play a4, b4, just rush all the pawns on the queen side, actually. But interesting from Nepo, who has also played the Grunfeld in his past, he sees a great moment to just blow open the center. And actually, that's something you often don't do in the King's Indian defense, blow open the center, right? Because usually white is stronger in the center. You don't ever really get a good chance to do it. And then you start playing weird moves on the side, trying to set up your kingside attack, and you're more and more out of position, so you less and less want to open up the center. But having that experience of also having played the Grunfeld, he spots a moment. Just play the simplifying trade. And then just, boom, let's get a solid center here. Castles here. Now white's got a stupid isolated pawn. You know, black is, I mean, at least equal already. If I had to choose where to sit down at the board, I would choose to sit down on black's side already, for me. This piece seems to have a lot of perspective, and by perspective, I mean prospect. Bishop seems to have great prospects. I wanted an adjective for somebody who has prospects. Very prospectful bishop. And, you know, you're just very solid with c6, holding this file off. This pawn doesn't look too dangerous. Seems like the worst thing that could happen is white quickly plays d5, trades for your c pawn, and draws the game, which is not bad from a black perspective. 10 moves into a game. He goes knight d5 without even playing c6, just occupies the square. Kamer plays an ambitious move here, let's say, b5. That's, you know, to fight against possible c6 by Nepo. Be able to trade on c6 and give him a weak pawn. Oh, Nepo pokes that a pawn from the side. Oops, that was too aggressive, Vincent. Ooh, now you messed up. Now you in trouble. Yeah. Now it's some real strategic trouble, because now he's got these two isolated pawns that are both kind of just duds. Just kind of sitting there like, what are we doing? Yeah. So I guess he shouldn't have done that, huh? You should not have done that. What he should have done is anyone's question. Somebody in chat is asking whether knight e5 would be a good move, either here or somewhere else. Sometimes you can go bishop g5, and, you know, black doesn't want to move the f pawn. Maybe something like rook e1 and bishop g5. Someone else is suggesting, oh, sorry, the same person has suggested bishop b2 and knight e5. Yeah, you could play this position with a bishop on b2 and just plunk your knight on e5 and, you know, just try and be strong enough and central enough to not lose. You might want to defend this pawn with queen d2 before doing that, or maybe you don't need it. My guess would be rook e1 would be the best move first, going to the open file, trying to be fancy about knight b4. I'm hoping that knight b4 bishop g5 would win for white, so I'm trying to be cheeky about that and play a more aggressive move, and, you know, spend less time doing obeisances to my opponent's threats. Here, maybe looking at bishop g5, knight g5 can be a little loose for the opponent there, and, you know, you probably just get, well, then if you get bishop e6, you've got the option of knight g5 as well as knight e5. But yeah, I'm going to say, Claude, I don't think the bishop should go this way here. I like better, it feels like there's a little bit of room on the king side to poke with this piece. So yeah, I think rook e1. I don't know. I like this kind of position with black. I get it sometimes, and now I'm suddenly remembering like some of the ways things slightly go wrong for me sometimes. You know, like I can't find a way to keep all my pieces, avoid all the trades, getting poked by knight g5 or knight e5. I can't put my queen here. And I don't really want to grab the pawn. So So maybe it's still fine for Vincent. I don't like this move at all, though. Like, now I'm... No. Now we got some worries. Okay, he plays bishop g5. Nepo just dodges it there. Goes for bishop h6, maybe. Allows it. Yeah, it's not logical to fight for a file that you can't fight for. Do you guys know that idea? Like, now that you've played rook a6, what are you doing fighting for the e file? All you're doing is you have to concede the file, and now your back rank is weak. I hope this lesson reaches somebody. Right? And that one day they'll think to themselves, what am I doing fighting for a file that I can't actually fight for? And then they won't do rook e8. It's such an obvious move for black. But yeah, Nepo goes bishop e6, rook e1, c6, solidifying d5. If Vincent wants to get something going here, the ideas are knight e5 to g4, bishop h6, or h4, h5, h6. But this is a little bit of a wandery move. Nepo reconnects the rooks, thinking he's going rook e8 next. He is. Vincent correctly figures out he's going rook e8 next, makes the bishop trade before he can't anymore, which makes knight e5 and knight c5 better squares. I think he's still holding the balance just fine for white. That's a little weird. Rook e5 is a little weird. h6, doubles, f6, gets out of the way, bishop f7. And now Kamer's the one who's putting a lot of rooks on a file that he can't win on. The reason he can't win on this file is because if he trades all the rooks, it's bad for him. But now he has to trade rooks because he doubled rooks on this file. If he'd put the knight on e5, would f6 have still come in at some point and just traded a bunch of pieces? Maybe so, yeah. Maybe so. But the knight would have gone on to greener pastures on the queen's side or on g4. Whereas in the game, as you're going to see, this knight is actually kind of stuck being passive now. And now he goes knight h2, looking for g4. Yeah. But Nepo says no. He makes more weaknesses, but he fights the knight, and it takes longer for this piece to come back into the game. So I think rook e5 is probably a step in the wrong direction for white. And my suspicion would be that knight e5 is the more normal way to keep things going. You'll notice that if you go knight d3 to c5, that could be useful, or even on knight c4 you could go knight a5 to annoy this pawn structure, because this rook is needed in both directions, right? So potentially here, here, here. I guess on queen c7 would stop knight a5, yeah. Okay, anyway, my little guess is that knight e5 would have been better than this. I like that h5 move. What's he planning against knight e3? White played queen e1. Knight e3, knight b6. Okay, maybe he would have just retreated anyway. Maybe there's no big calculation that we need to do. Back and forth. Okay, position's just solid. Looking at queen h6. Oh, cool. And just gradually, white looks like they're still fine, honestly. Because the black king position is kind of loose. It's hard to undertake any big actions. Looks like white's still fine. But I like the idea of bringing the knight to f5. Is he finally going to do that now? Ooh, white gave up access to the queen. I guess trades are really good for black, huh? This might have been a moment to trade, though. Could this be the moment where white could trade and hold on? You wouldn't want to push d5, because this pawn just pushes past, and then this pawn is even weaker. You would want to then bring your king here. I mean, it's not clear that white's losing that endgame, is it? No. If black traded knights, or sorry, I mean, let's just say if knights were off the board, what's the evaluation on the king and pawn ending? We put a king on d5 and a king on d3. Then if white has to move, they lose. And if black has to move, it's probably a draw. So it would be all about how many tempi were there? White's got a lot of tempi left on the king side. Huh. Looking at a queen and pawn ending. That's interesting and sick. If you trade knights on f5 and the king recaptures and the white king comes to f3, then you could have a standoff between kings on f5 and f3 instead of d5 and d3. Right? And if the white king has to move and let the black king into one of those squares, black probably wins. If the white king has to, and if the black king has to back off, then white's fine. But there the king on f3 is kind of blocking some of your pawn moves. And so I was calculating a4, b5, a5, b4, a6, b3, a7, b2, a8, b1. And then white gets to go on and checks first. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know the evaluation of going to the king and pawn ending here or the knight and pawn ending. So he keeps the queens on the board. I mean, I guess in general, queen endings are the most drawish, and king and pawn endings are the most winish, and knight and pawn endings are the most winish after that. So it does make sense to avoid queen trades. I was just thinking maybe with the space in the center and the knight, you could draw this with the king. What's going on here? Okay. If queen d4, queen b7, so he attacks the pawn another time. So this pawn's looking really dead, but Kamer has a tricky move, knight c4. And if knight d4, he must be planning this move with an advantage for white by surprise. Very nice. Very nice trick. So that's what's going on with knight c4. King e7 to keep the knight out, but now there's a lot of room on this side of the king. So we see like queen g8. No, he goes all the way after the queen side. Knight d8, wow. Okay. Marathon. Marathon. Yeah. I watched this part of the game live here. They're struggling around the b7 pawn, and this queen comes in, and here, finally, Nepo gets like... I thought it was clear that he had a big advantage with the queen on e1. I mean, he had an advantage throughout because his pawn structure is more compact, and he had two different pawns he could be attacking. But here, when he gets into this square, you know, this stuff can't be defended anymore because the queen's defending the knight. She can't come back and cover this. You know, f3, queen h4. So here I thought he's probably winning. So I wonder if queen, you know, somewhere here there's a mistake. You know, is it that at some point White's king should have been on f1 to stop intrusions? Maybe. I don't know. It's just so hard to say. When a game is so long, eventually, you know, produces some errors for Vincent or for anyone studying the game. But yeah, he plays knight f7, and now if queen takes, of course, you take the knight. So the knight takes, and now queen f2. And yeah, this pawn here can't be defended. Suppose king here, g5 is worth mentioning. Rethreatening this queen checkmate, and if pawn takes, you bring this knight right at yourself with devastating impact. It hops all the way from f7 to f3 in 2 moves, all with check, and then it's mate next move, queen h4. And I don't know, something like g3, g4 checkmate. That'll do it. So suddenly it's like a powerful attack. Nepo's going to win this pawn. Kamer is going to try and queen the a pawn while the king gets attacked. And the question is, you know, well, Nepo always has a draw in hand, right? He's never going to lose to the a pawn. He can always get perpetual. The question is, can he set up a checkmating net faster than the a pawn can queen? Because with what these knights are doing, this knight can't come back into the center to try and draw the game or defend the king. But this knight can't head over this way to deal with the a pawn at all, right? So he grabs this and starts advancing the g pawn to try and checkmate with. Now, Kamer uses the queen here, but if he just keeps pushing, what would happen? Here, here, check, here, check, here. Knight f3 is possible, right? But is it good? Doesn't look that good. I almost found a miraculous checkmate here. Queen d1, king takes g3 is not instantly obvious. I was thinking of the following. Check, here, check, here, check, here, check, here, and mate. But king f2, and you're still going. All right, so let's see here. g3 here, knight here, here. Yeah, I'm not seeing the win just yet. It's cool that you have this square, and I'll just explain to people why I'm looking at that move, because then you get another queen. Let's see. Maybe knight e4 would do it, defending this pawn and just going queen h1 checkmate. If white queens, you give checkmate. If white checks you, you just come here. And there's no more checks, right? Ta-da! Okay. So that's how you can weave a mating net just in time. I mean, the white pawn's on a7. And it doesn't yet look like black's threatening checkmate, right? Check here, check here. Not that. Here. And then this move. Okay, you could do this. Check here. Oh, I'm going to enjoy this final move. King here, preparing queen h5. Right. I think this is the only move that stops mate. And then f5, keeping her out. What do you think? Did we do it? That was not easy by any measure. But Nepo calculated all this stuff like very, very, very quickly in the game, right? I mean, he went for this, and you know, maybe he had a better checkmate in mind or a better attack in mind, but he went for all this very quickly, just pushing the G pawn. I mean, if you were playing this game, you would be calculating very nervously whether you were queening or the A pawn was there. But yeah, he got it pretty fast. All right, the queen comes here to cover this square against g4 to maybe be able to play here or knight d8, potentially, right? So you're stopping any knight checks on g5, preparing knight d8 as well. But now he's able to take out the pawn in the center, and now he can legit keep an eye on the A pawn as well as attacking the king. And this becomes even safer win for black. Advancing the G pawn here. A6 can't be played because of check and capturing it. So basically, you've got all these tactics available when the opponent's king is exposed. Extra options for you. His queen has been placed here, so it also stops knight d8 and knight d6. So this position he's got under control. Oh yeah, he can't take on a6 because of knight d8 or knight d6. I think he could take on a6 and then just go to a2. Interesting. He just goes for the attack here. Threatening check, check, check on h4, h2. h1. Queen's got to come off the back rank. Ooh. That's a nice one. Hits him with knight f3. If pawn takes, check, here, check. And wherever the king goes, he can queen. So he hits him with the knight f3. King has to go here, here. Collects the g2 pawn with check. Forces the king up. Queen f2. King e4. And if you trade queens here and push g2, white can't catch that g pawn, but white plays a7 and a8. And then you still have to win a queen endgame again. So here he plays knight e5. And yeah, I mean, I guess like the point is here, 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 here. He can drive the white king immediately into a mating net over there. And if white just pushes his pawn, he's threatening another mating net over here, using the queen to block white's own liberties. Very nasty, yes. So knight e5, queen d5, check, here, check. And now the knight's covering the a pawn, and he can just trade queens after king c5 and queen. And so that was 80 plus moves. Nepo took it, tied for first place in the tournament. So yeah. Fantastic performance by Nepo, right? I mean, what can we say? That was very, very strong. He really wore Vincent out in that game. Would have worn anybody else in the world out as well, pretty much, except for Magnus, who would have enjoyed playing that game with him. But Nepo really looked very strong, right? What can we say? Long tournament, long game, grinding with black, and tying for first place without his opening prep. So that was the WR Masters. Absolutely huge success for all three of the players who tied for first place, in my opinion. Gukesh, second big invitational super tournament. Weikanze didn't go well. Here he showed how much he had learned in just a very short period of time. And you can expect Gukesh to continue climbing up. And then we've got Levon, who turned around from 2022, where people were thinking he was, where some people were noticing, a bad patch of form for him. And he looked great this tournament, very aggressive, and great technique as well. But a lot of energy, really, really notable there. We'll see him in action next week, or actually at the end of this week. We're not that far off from the American Cup. That's going to be the next big event for Aronian, and the next big event for me, because I'll be covering that live starting this Friday for about 10 days. And then of course, I would say great for Nepo, who ties for first with two people who are having great tournaments while he's, preparing for the World Championship and hiding his openings. And he showed everything that you would want to see from Nepo before the World Championship match. So all three of these people, very, very strong, successful events. And I hope you enjoyed it. And we'll see you later around Chess Dojo. All right, cut right there. 234, 235. All right, I don't have to run immediately, but now we'll chit-chat a little bit. That'll be the end of what they put on YouTube, what Braden will put on YouTube, hopefully. So yes, Seth, we will be covering the American Cup on Chess Dojo pretty much every round. I'm going to skip the first weekend, but then the final round is on that next Saturday, and I will arrange babysitting and cover the last round on Saturday the 25th or 4th or something like that. So yeah, we'll be covering almost the whole thing. Starting this Friday live. We'll have, the field is insane. I think the 7th seed out of 8 players is Ray Robson at 2,700. If you wonder how many super GMs there are in the US, and the 8th seed is Sam Sevian, who's at 2,690. He's also super strong. So this is an absolutely insane field. The B section, or women's section, also really, really strong. Nazi Paikidze is playing, who hasn't played for a while. And to give a sense of how strong that section is, I think Alice Lee is maybe the 6th or 7th seed, like Ray Robson in the A section. So we'll be watching section A and B probably as much as we can. It's going to be tough. There's going to be so much good chess in the first 1 or 2 rounds. But because it is a knockout, at some point it'll be easier to pick which games to concentrate on, as there are fewer players playing. So we'll easily be able to cover groups A and B once we get to the final couple days, and we're down to 3 players per section. On the first day, obviously, we won't be able to cover 8 matches at once. But that's what's coming up. And I've put a bunch of information on the Google Calendar for scheduling. Yeah, it's the format again, which I think is great. Double elimination, one-on-one matches. If you look on the dojo calendar, which is down below the video player somewhere, You can see that I added some shows. Wait, they're not showing up. It says loading, loading. What's up with that? Oh, there it is. Okay, now I can see it. Yeah, I added in a bunch of shows. So, yeah, and even ahead to the next week, for those of you who subscribe to the dojo calendar, I filled it all the way through next week. Tomorrow, I'm gonna do the post-mortem for the first time since I returned here in March. But it's going to be the post-mortem miniatures edition. So please bring a short and scintillating game if you'd like me to look at one of your games. And for this edition, it's absolutely fine to bring me a game that you won or a game that you lost. I don't care for tomorrow at all. Basically, I'm kind of trying to combine the post-mortem with my book project to try and collect a bunch of miniature games. So I'm just looking for anything scintillating you have, and if the best thing you have in the way of short games is one that you won, show it to me. So that'll be tomorrow morning, and that's all I've got for today for all of you.